time frames.
Is there something to be said of that more frequent pivot and our more like kind of modern ministry?
I think you have that sense of, you can have that sense of identity. That sense of identity is a lot stronger in the community in some ways because they know what their identity is,
right,
versus a lot of times a traditional church may have a really strong identity, but they don't always know how to articulate it. Mm-hmm. They certainly don't always know how to share it with their wider community. And because you're doing that work of rethinking and like you're kind of like redoing that work of ministry over and over again, you know who you are, and you like in a way that you can share and it's digestible. And so that's a huge advantage on one hand, but the negative is like, it's a little like running on a treadmill where, you know, like you're like, didn't we just do a visioning process like a year ago? And you're like, cause if your folks are changing and you like the vision we had when we were renting the .com building needed to look different than when we moved into a Julia Morgan sanctuary, right? Like you can't, the same vision doesn't work in the same place because you have to take advantage of like, what are our advantages where in the silver box, you look like a less traditional church, so you can lean into that a little more versus when you're in a stained glass area, you're like, it's not like we became instantly a traditional congregation, but we had some new assets now where you had that sort of like ancient future thing going on where you could be like, you don't have to create that feeling of sacredness in the same way you did in the .com, but you do have to kind of now, what are the signals we can give to folks to show them that we're up on what's going on in the life of a young adult, where you're like the young adult who might be skeptical walking into a more traditional looking building where like, hey, you know, my friend invites me to come to worship on Sunday morning or even Sunday night, like at this .com building. You're kind of like, well, I might as well figure out what, you know, I don't have a lot of expectations other than I will know what it is when I get there kind of thing. You're like, you can sort of witness it.
Yeah.
When you walk into a more traditional building, there's a little more of like,
been there, done
what
that.
will I find?
Yeah.
Like, or like there's either that expectation that I know exactly what this will be like, or the neat thing is you can craft it in such a way when they walk in, they're like, but I've not seen this before.
Right.
And but it's like the same vision doesn't work in both places. So you have to kind of redo some of that work on a regular basis in a way that you can allow a vision to unfold more slowly in a traditional congregational context where there's history there. You know, there's like this congregation's been here since, you know, 1887 or whatever it is. I hope I get that number right, but you know, like it's that sort of part of going like this sanctuary, you know, there was a fire in the 1930s here and the old folding wooden building like burnt down and they rebuilt the sanctuary that's here was built in, you know, that 1930s. And then the education building was built 30 years later in the 1960s. It's like you have these like 30-year periods, 40-year periods that are defining of them as a congregation where you're like in the new church plant, you have like this year, and we had the same kind of markers, right? Like moving from this building to that building or having this person or bringing this person on staff or, you know, would change the dynamic a lot in the same kind of ways, but the time scale is so different.
Well, I mean, there's a more traditional environment very much sparks in me this idea of this is what we do versus this is who we are. And so it's very ingrained in this idea of these are our traditions, these are our practices.
Well, and the beauty of them is that hopefully they're ones that really serve you really well. Like sometimes they are, and sometimes they're not. I think that was one of the gifts of that COVID did, is it sort of forced the church to stop doing some things that it had always done.
Right.
And then as some ministry can, like as we as we begin this new like hybrid style stuff where it's like you don't get rid of what we had been doing during COVID, but you can do some things you used to do. Like we got a real opportunity to sort of ask, like, do we really miss that thing that we were doing?
Gotta be side by side.